Viking berserkers must have been on something to go into those hyper-aggressive rages, right? According to some schools of thought, Viking warriors might well have been drinking some kind of hallucinogenic tea made from stinking henbane that would have given them incredible energy, a resistance to pain, and endurance beyond belief, or perhaps chewing on dried mushrooms to help them get ready to fight. But was this really accurate, and did Vikings use drugs on a regular recreational basis? Our modern perception of Vikings is shaped by the media in the form of films, TV, books, and more, without having any real evidence to back up the idea that Vikings were invulnerable, crazed warriors. Using various things to get high is a trait as old as humanity, and is not even unique to us as a species. It's possible that our non-human primate ancestors were consuming alcoholic substances like fermented fruit even before we evolved into Homo sapiens. So Viking drugs are basically a given. We know that they drank ale and mead, but what about the harder stuff? Were Vikings snorted ground up mushrooms before every battle, or were they using infusions to find a trance-like state? But before we even dive into the details and theories about which drugs Vikings preferred, we should look at whether or not this sort of behavior would be encouraged in the Viking Age, or whether it would have been frowned upon. Viking society was rich and highly stratified, so it's likely that any sort of drug taking was reserved for people with higher social standing like elite warriors, chieftains, or priests. Viking mythology is complex and could be argued to be animistic, with a strong connection to both the world around them and the spirit world. And if we compare the Vikings to other similar cultures, it wouldn't be a huge leap to say that they may well have used psychedelics to enhance their rituals. But just what would they have been using? Welcome to the Viking Vault. Mushrooms. It's difficult to say for sure, although there are many theories about how the Vikings found their incredible prowess in battle, including the thought that Viking berserkers were using flyagaric to find this powerful rage. Flyagaric is the common name for Amanita muscaria, or the most stereotypical mushroom you'd picture with its characteristic red cap and white spots. Native to the northern hemisphere, flyagaric works by producing two compounds, one that excites the nervous system and one that induces a hallucinogenic state whilst also being a slight depressant. This combination of compounds makes you feel like you're drunk whilst also bringing on hallucinations and possibly inducing a state of rage. According to some sources, using these mushrooms would also make everything feel small and unimportant thanks to something called micropsy. If you feel like everything is much smaller than you, it might lead to feeling omnipotent and able to take on the world. However, there is a decided drawback to taking mushrooms to feel like you're a god among Vikings. As you'd come down from the high, you're likely to experience vomiting, twitching, and diarrhea. While unpleasant for the warrior twitching in their own excretions, perhaps it's still off-putting enough to knock the enemy off their stride, at least for a moment. Henbane. Other schools of thought believe that Vikings could have been using Hyoscyamus niger or stinking henbane to fuel their berserker rage. Originally native to the Mediterranean, henbane spread into northern Europe and was definitely found in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Henbane has been used medically to cure various ailments like stomach pain or muscle cramps, but it can be poisonous if consumed in too high a quantity. A researcher from Slovenia has argued that henbane produces similar results to flyagaric mushrooms, as they both produce hallucinogenic states, tremors, and a heightened sense of aggression and resistance to pain, but it is a far more likely candidate for berserker rage. The researcher Karsten Fatur argued that it's more likely that Vikings were consuming henbane, since flyagaric is not as common throughout Scandinavia as henbane is. Further arguments in favour of Vikings using stinking henbane as their drug of choice to fuel a berserker rage stem from the common symptoms of henbane intoxication. Taking henbane, either smoking or drinking a tea made from it, generally has a strong impact on a person's physical and mental state. You're likely to experience an altered mental state and start behaving erratically, as well as getting really flushed in the face and starting to have muscle spasms and twitches. On top of all that, your blood will draw away from the surface of your skin, and you won't feel pain even half as strongly. Some researchers think that the reason it was said that weapons would cut no better than sticks against berserkers could be due to this movement of the blood. If their blood was further from the surface, wounds might look like they're bleeding less, thus giving rise to the legend that berserkers are impervious to sword and axe blades. One final argument as to why henbane might be a more likely candidate for the berserkers is the tendency to want to get naked once you've taken it. This desire to strip down in the middle of battle was documented by a monk in the 9th century who described the Viking army as all bare-armed and bare-backed. As well as all of this, Henbane also leaves you feeling weak and tired as you come down afterwards, which was also mentioned in the sagas. Repeated use of the drug can lead to insanity and uncontrollable rage, further supporting the idea that berserkers could have been ingesting Henbane. Often in the sagas, berserkers are portrayed as outcasts who continually cause trouble and end up living a solitary life on the edge of society. If they truly were using Henbane to enhance their strength and prowess in battle, then it's possible that it would send them mad over time. The drugs in the record. It's still hard to say exactly how Vikings would have ingested Henbane. It's not like we've found a medieval bong with a helpful inscription that details how to take your pre-battle drugs. Some people think that they drank it in tea or rubbed it into their skin using goose fat, but it's not easy to say exactly how they would have been taking this, or even if they used it at all. However, there is one possible link in the archaeological record that could point to Henbane being used in some rituals at least. In an old Viking settlement in Denmark near Fjerkrat, a number of graves were excavated, including a very unusual one that seemed to contain the remains of a highly respected woman, possibly a seer or priestess. Along with the grave goods, she was buried with a pouch containing Henbane seeds, which she may have distributed to berserkers before battle. That being said, we can't infer anything concrete from this, as it's a pretty isolated find. She may simply have been the village healer, or just had a habit for chewing Henbane seeds. We simply can't say. We know from later sources that Henbane was a common ingredient for witches, being used topically as a witch's salve or to create a mildly hallucinogenic smoke when tossed on a fire. As well as the pouch of Henbane seeds, the woman found at Fjerkrat also had some other items that lend credence to the fact that she may have been a witch or used drugs. In her buckle, the archaeologists found traces of white lead, which was often used in skin ointments. Perhaps she would combine this with the Henbane to induce a trance-like state so she could see the future. Hempen rope and hempen smoke. And now to the big question. Did Vikings like to smoke pot? Again, it's not entirely certain. There are signs that Viking farmers cultivated cannabis plants in both Scandinavia and America, but we can't be sure how they used the plant once it was grown. In 2019, researchers in Newfoundland uncovered some rather unusual remains that dated to early Viking activity in Canada. One of the ecological layers was made up of cannabis pollen, and cannabis is not native to that region. Along with this archaeological evidence from Canada, there is also evidence from a farm in southern Norway that shows that the farmers there were actively growing hemp. The archaeologists in Norway argue that it must have been grown deliberately because the pollen count is too high for it to have migrated there naturally, and the farm itself is remote, so that seemed to show that it was a widespread crop. However, what we don't know is how the crop would have been used once it's grown. Cannabis or hemp is commonly used as a drug these days, but our Viking ancestors would have had a different use for it. Hemp was a fantastic source of plant fibers that would get treated and then turned into cloth or rope. We do know that hemp was often used to make the ropes found on Viking ships. It may have also been grown for multiple reasons. Cannabis is often used as a form of pain relief, and could have been used back in the Viking Age for the same reason. A woman buried at the Oseberg ship burial was found with a pouch of cannabis seeds. She was old and seemed to have suffered from a lot of ill health, and so it's likely that she had a pouch of seeds to chew to help her relieve the pain, or they were a status symbol. Outro. While it's very tempting to say that the only reasonable explanation for a berserker rage in the Viking era was drugs, it's not as clear-cut as that. There is no mention throughout the sagas of Vikings ingesting anything more potent than alcohol, and we even have an account in Gretti's saga where Grettis gets a group of berserkers so drunk that they can't fight anymore. Through all of the evidence we have that comes from the Viking Age, there are no references to warriors taking drugs to improve their prowess in battle. We do have evidence that some plants may have been used in medicinal or ritualistic ways. The fact that the Fjerkrat seeress had these Henbane seeds in a pouch when she was buried indicates that they were important to her. But can we say categorically that Vikings used drugs on a regular basis? Not really. None of the literature supports that theory, and we haven't got any physical evidence to show that it was part of any ritual or religion. It's still possible that Viking warriors could have used psychedelics to psych themselves up before a battle, but it's equally possible that they were simply incredibly skilled warriors who used psychological tactics to give themselves courage and intimidate their enemies. And when it comes to everyday life and drug usage, well, Vikings are still humans at the end of the day. I think we can say with confidence that it's likely that, if the means were available, Vikings would have taken full advantage of Henbane or Fly Agaric to get high, and passed the winter evenings a little more enjoyably. Thank you for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying the videos on this channel, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, have a great week. Cheers!